Excellent. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next Center for Mind Ethics and Policy event in our speaker series. My name is Jeff Sebo, and I direct CMEP, and I'm very happy to be hosting this event today on animals in cost benefit analysis. I think most of you are now familiar with our center, but for those of you who might not be, the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy is a research and outreach and field building center here at New York University that examines the nature and intrinsic value of non-human minds with special focus on animals and AI systems, given their importance and difficulty as research subjects. And so we ask which non-humans matter and how much they matter and what they want and need and what we owe them and what follows for our practices and our policies and our priorities. And as part of that, figuring out how to include the actual or potential interests of non-humans in the decision-making processes that we use in governments, like cost-benefit analysis, is very important. So we are very happy to be able to have a conversation about exactly how to do that with non-human animals with Andy Stawasz. And so what I will do is introduce him, and then there'll be a talk, and then there'll be a discussion during which I can relay your questions and comments to Andy. So as you hear Andy talk about including animals in cost benefit analysis, please go ahead whenever you like and enter your questions and comments in the Q&A tab on Zoom. And then when we hit the discussion period, I can go ahead and read your questions and comments to him and we can have a discussion. So thank you so much to everybody for being here and really looking forward to the conversation. With that in mind, I am now delighted to introduce Andrew Stawasz. He is a faculty fellow at the University of Michigan Law School. His teaching and research explore what values are reflected in the economic analyses that guide legal decision-making, especially agency benefit cost analyses. He draws on his experience as an advisor at the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Biden-Harris administration, as a legal fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law, where we were very happy to have him on the NYU campus for a little while, and as research associate at Data for Decisions LLC. Before moving to Michigan, he also clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. So Andy, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for working on these issues. Really looking forward to the conversation. And whenever you are ready, feel free to share your slides and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks to Audrey. Thanks to the many other people at CMEP who were, I'm sure, instrumental in putting this together. I'm really delighted to be here talking today. I also want to gratefully acknowledge support from the Brooks Institute Emerging Scholars Fellowship for supporting some of the work that underlies this paper, Animals in Cost-Benefit Analysis, which is published in the University of Michigan Journal of Law Reform, if you want to read more about this topic. So this is a talk about welfare, and it's particularly a talk about whose welfare counts in the welfarist cost-benefit analyses that largely guide the enormously powerful administrative state. And the administrative state exercises this enormous power routinely with huge consequences over humans and animals alike. So I know that some folks on this call might not be lawyers or otherwise familiar with the administrative state. So I'm going to just say a few words about what I mean when I refer to the administrative state. I'll say why it matters and why CBA matters within it. So I'll start by just sort of talking around the idea that the administrative state is really huge and powerful. So the number of full-time equivalent employees as of January 20th, 2025 in the so-called social and economic agencies was estimated somewhere around 230,000 people. These people are very busy doing many, many things, among which are publishing in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is a publication that announces what agencies are doing, including issuing proposed and final regulations. And this is not a small amount of activity. The Federal Register clocks in at some 70 to 90,000 pages per year. And if you've ever had the misfortune of reading it, you know that that print is really tiny. And so you know that there is a lot going on at these agencies, like the Department of Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of the Interior, and so on and so on. So you can start to see why this really matters for animals. The regulations that these agencies issue wind up in a compendium called the Code of Federal Regulations. These are regulations with the force and effect of law that clocks in again at some 190,000 pages again as of 2025. You might wonder what's happened under the newest administration. It is true that they are doing less by way of procedure, and that they are, taking some notice requirements as might, be reflected in the Federal Register somewhat less seriously than prior administrations. But I don't want to overstate it. They are still doing a lot through the regulatory process that I'm describing here. And even insofar as they are doing less in the way of traditional regulation and rulemaking, that could plausibly rebound soon, either under the next administration or as the Trump administration's shortcuts past this kind of regular regulation sort of get struck down in court and they try again through more normal processes. So this is still broadly representative of how busy agencies are setting rules. Now, within this rulemaking process, cost-benefit analysis plays a major role. Now, I don't want to overstate CBA's role. It is not always the main thing driving rulemaking, but I also don't want to understate it. So there's been an unbroken thread of executive orders since at least President Reagan requiring benefit cost analysis of at least a lot of rules. So the current state of the art is that agencies must do a CBA for so-called economically significant rules. Now, these are really, really big rules. These are rules with effects totaling at least $100 million in any one year. And of course, even for those rules that don't quite hit that threshold, agencies often still may do a cost-benefit analysis. And for those rules where agencies do cost-benefit analysis, again, many of which are really, really huge, that CBA in large part guides whether to issue the rule at all. These executive orders that are still in effect guiding CBA say not to issue a rule unless the agency determines that the benefits justify the costs, unless a statute requires otherwise. And it can guide how stringent the rule winds up being. As between various alternatives for regulation, these executive orders say, again, unless a statute requires otherwise, you ought to select the alternative that maximizes net benefits, that is, benefits minus costs. And for those rules, it often plays a starring role. That is, cost-benefit analysis often plays a starring role in a judicial challenge to the regulation. So whether it survives judicial review might hinge in no small part on a cost-benefit analysis. And even otherwise, there are more informal ways that cost-benefit analyses can nudge the rule. So for example, significant rules, including these economically significant rules, undergo review by an agency within the executive office of the president that Jeff mentioned I used to work at, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. OIRA will review these rules and their underlying CBAs. So the CBAs can influence the rules even before they are released for the public. And again, what is happening under this newer administration? Well, if anything, it is doing even more CBA. It has extended these unbroken thread of executive orders to even more agencies than had been subject to these orders beforehand. It is true, you may have read in the news, for example, the New York Times has done some coverage of some of the particularly bad CBAs that this administration has put out, but it is still regulating through the modality of CBA in no small part. So What does this wind up meaning for animals? Just to give a small flavor, it turns out a whole lot. These are some of the standards that are set using this rulemaking process. Standards for cultivated meat labels, humane standards requiring certain minimum levels of treatment for some USDA organic foods. And it turns out the Food and Drug Administration actually regulates pet food safety, which affects animals through multiple channels, both the animals that enter the pet food system and the animals, of course, who eat the pet food and are more or less safe because of this rule. But I want to focus on one particularly famous rule that underlies a famous case in the environmental and administrative law canons. This is Entergy versus Riverkeeper. This is a Supreme Court decision about an EPA regulation of cooling water intake structures. Now, what these structures are for power plants that are sited on water bodies. The power plants need to cool down their systems. So what these structures do is suck in a lot of the water from that water body in order to use that water to help cool the power plant. Now, they suck in the water using an absolutely enormous amount of force. And then, not surprisingly, that has huge effects on the aquatic animals living in those water bodies. So impingement occurs, a sort of euphemistic term, when a fish is trapped against the intake screen. And that enormous amount of force I mentioned might kill the fish by forcing their gills shut and they asphyxiate. It might kill them by crushing them under the weight of the many other fish. They may die of exhaustion trying to resist this enormous amount of force, and so on and so forth. Entrainment occurs for the even smaller fish who actually pass through the intake screen, enter the power plant itself, and then die any number of really unimaginably painful ways. Now, this is no small sideshow, right? According to EPA's estimates, these cooling water intake structures that it was regulating killed some 3+ billion age 1 equivalent fish every year. Now, the age 1 equivalent modifier, don't really worry about it because the point is, it's a huge number of fish, no matter which way you slice it. And the decision on how stringently to regulate to save these fish was ultimately going to decide the fate of some hundreds of millions, potentially, of fish. Now, I don't think I need to pause on this point for this audience for too long, but essentially no scientific debate exists anymore, as best I understand it, as to whether fish are sentient. They mostly to all are, or whether they feel pain. They mostly to all do. So an absolutely enormous amount was at stake for the fish community with respect to how stringently EPA would regulate. So how did EPA regulate? It regulated according to the results of a cost-benefit analysis. Now, what entered this all-important analysis? On the cost side, it was, relatively straightforward. The cost of installing and running new technology, for example. But what about the benefits of the saved fish? Now, EPA had little trouble monetizing the costs, but for monetizing the benefits, EPA was able to come up with the use value of some of the fish that would be saved. That is, the value to humans of leaving some of these fish available for fishing, like catching or eating, and so on. And they were able to come up with a non-zero use value for something like 1.8% of the fish that would be saved. The other 98.2% of the fish got absolutely nothing. And just to put a fine point on it, 100% of the saved fish, or potentially saved fish, got absolutely nothing with respect to their own interests. What does this mean? This means an all-important quasi-welfarist analysis ignored the welfare of well over 99.9% of welfare-having subjects that would be affected by this rule. That should at least give us pause to question this gap. And what I want to suggest for the remainder of the talk is that on closer examination, there's actually no defensible moral or policy case for this state of affairs. So I'm going to talk about now why this status quo should fall and how we can get there. First, the why question. I'm going to advance two claims, the weak claim and the strong claim. The weak claim is going to argue that agencies typically may value animals in their cost-benefit analyses. The strong claim goes a step further, that they often must, so long as they're setting the rule in part based on a cost-benefit analysis and the regulation would substantially affect animals' interests. In other words, the weak claim says that it's often not unlawful to value animals' interests in these CBAs. The strong claim says it very well may be unlawful for agencies to decline to do so. So to start with the weak claim, the structure of the claim as I see it is essentially that there are no legal barriers, in fact, for agencies to value animals in their CBAs. Then, if I am correct that there are no legal barriers, we ought to presume it is allowed to value animals in CBA. So what are the legal barriers that we might intuit would stand in the way? Well, we might start with the Constitution. Of course, agencies can't regulate outside what the Constitution permits. And you might intuit, well, gosh, the Constitution talks of the people of the United States being the source of government legitimacy and so on. So regulating in a way that benefits someone outside the people of the United States may be a losing battle. Well, as a first cut, I'm actually not so sure that we know how the people of the United States would react to my proposal. There's been work, for example, from Romain Espinosa and Nicolas Treisch showing that, at least in France, surveys showed people are quite happy as a general matter to let animals into the cost-benefit analyses and other analyses guiding policymaking. And there have been ballot initiatives that have succeeded in the United States, for example, that benefited animals to the expense of at least some humans. So I'm not sure that the people of the United States would categorically prohibit agencies from valuing animals in these CBAs. Moreover, we don't always regulate just based on the people of the United States. For example, in cost-benefit analysis, a common metric is the social cost of greenhouse gases. And that has at times been set with attention to the value of people's interests outside the United States, climate costs for people in other countries. And that has never been challenged or, of course, struck down on constitutional grounds. So I don't see why this would be any different here. Indeed, existing federal laws show some non-trivial attention to animals' interests, even at some human expense. And those have all survived under constitutional scrutiny. For example, we have the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Horse Protection Act, the so-called 28-hour law, and so on. Those events that it should not be constitutionally fatal to regulate in favor of animals' interests. So I actually don't think the Constitution is in fact a bar. What about the organic statutes? These are the laws that Congress passes that enable agencies to act in the first place. Agencies cannot act without an organic statute, and they cannot act outside the boundaries drawn by their organic statutes. Now, this is a little bit hard to talk about in the abstract because there are so many organic statutes governing so many agencies that do so many sorts of regulations, but some generalizations are still possible, I think. Indeed, all are silent, not surprisingly, on the question of whether agencies may value animals in their CBA. And you might think, well, how should we interpret that silence? It seems weird to think that even though it didn't say so, Congress would in fact allow us agencies to value animals when we do cost-benefit analyses. I'm not so sure that's a good reading of congressional silence in this case. Indeed, most people and most legal systems evince some sort of agreement that animals matter more than zero. So reading congressional silence as implying that agencies not only may but must value animals' interests at zero seems out of step with a lot of people's priorities. Indeed, a lot of Congress's own apparent priorities, as with those laws I recited earlier. It put differently, if in fact Congress by default wants to value animals at zero, that would put it out of step with the broad public and indeed many of its own apparent decisions. So I don't think statutory silence should typically be read to prohibit valuing animals in CBAs. Now, what about the Administrative Procedure Act, a really important statute for administrative law and regulation? This says that agencies cannot take actions, including regulations, that are arbitrary, capricious, or an abuse of discretion. Well, how to read this? One of the questions that courts ask with an arbitrariness challenge is whether the agency relied on a factor that it wasn't supposed to rely on. Well, could animals be one such factor? Again, I don't think so, mainly for the same reason. I don't think we should read congressional silence as implying that agencies must value animals at zero. And there's no other sort of arbitrariness challenge that I can imagine agencies losing under, as long as they include a sufficiently robust explanation as to why they're regulating in service of animals and considering their interests in their CBAs. So I don't think this is generally a bar either. What about the executive orders I mentioned earlier, like Executive Order 12866, that govern agency cost-benefit analysis? It does list a bunch of philosophies and principles that ought to guide regulation in this executive order. And not surprisingly, again, none of it mentions the interests of animals. How to read that? Fairly simply, I don't think that's an exhaustive list of principles and philosophies that agencies are allowed to take account of. So I don't think this is a bar either. And if none of these are bars, I think the best reading is that agencies have the discretion to value animals' interests in CBA. Indeed, the DC Circuit, which is the court that has reviewed the lion's share of administrative law challenges, has been clear that agencies are allowed to regulate according to extra statutory factors that they, or maybe the executive branch writ large, have identified, so long as they explain how those factors are at least consistent with the factors that are in the statutes that guide agencies' rulemaking. I don't think this is any divergence from that principle. I think generally agencies should be read as having the authority to consider animals in their BCAs. So that, I think, shows the weak claim that agencies typically may value animals in their CBAs. Now, what about the strong claim, again, that agencies typically must do so, so long as they are using CBA in part to guide their rulemaking and the regulation would substantially affect animals? Put differently, I think that I'm going to defend the claim that agencies have no discretion to ignore animals' interests in those cases. Now, you might hear this and think, well, gosh, that seems like a really surprising result. Would it be true that a court would really strike down a rule because an agency ignored animals' interests? Just from a judicial realist perspective, that might not be right. Well, if you think that, fair enough. You can take anything I'm about to say and modify it slightly in your head to say that this ought to be unlawful, that this is at least immoral or a bad state of affairs if this is in fact lawful to ignore animals' interests. Because in one sense, the strong claim is strong, to be sure. I am saying that agencies typically don't have a say in the matter. They don't have discretion. But in another sense, I find the strong claim actually not that strong at all, because the alternative view seems to me even stronger. The alternative view says that agencies are allowed to treat animals' interests as mattering not at all, that no matter the strength of those interests, no matter how badly you would hurt animals, no matter how many animals you would hurt very badly, that matters absolutely not at all and could never change the decision. That to me seems like the stronger claim. At the very least, then, the only ethical option is to assign animals some value other than the status quo of zero. Why is that the only ethical option? Well, I'm going to start from the premise that cost benefit analysis is broadly a welfarist analysis, a welfare sensitive, welfare enhancing analysis. This is not just my claim. This is widely agreed upon in the CBA literature. Cass Sunstein, who embraces CBA as a decision rule, says this. Matt Adler, who embraces welfarism but prefers methods other than CBA to get there, has said this. Doug Kaiser, who opposes CBA as a decision rule, agrees that it is at least welfarist. He just thinks welfarism is broadly wrong. So what do philosophers have to say about welfarism and animals? Well, to start, welfarist philosophy is mostly utilitarian philosophy. So let's start there. What do utilitarians have to say about this? Well, for centuries now, I think there's been virtual consensus among at least many, now I would submit most to all utilitarians, that animals' utility counts. As Jeremy Bentham said in around the 1780s, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Some 200 years later, Peter Singer, another famous utilitarian, has argued that if a being suffers, including an animal being, quote, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. Holding otherwise, according to Singer, is tantamount to speciesism, which he defines as, quote, prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. Now, among utilitarians, there are differences on how much we ought to be counting animals' interests. For example, Shelley Kagan says they ought to be counted somewhat less than 1-to-1 with humans' interests. But even Kagan admits that this status quo of valuing at zero ought not be the way we do it within utilitarianism. But that is exactly how cost-benefit analysis, which largely stems from or relates to this ethical tradition, does things. I think no good reason exists for that strong divergence, valuing at zero the welfare of well over 99% of welfare havers. There are counter-arguments, to be sure, on both sides of thinking regulators should regulate in favor of animals. To start, I mean, you might think, well, we ought not be counting animals at all. Because, you know, all this stuff about counting animals is new. It's kind of theoretically imperfect and uncertain. That doesn't quite get all the way for me. Although this is true, I submit we ought to be regulating in a way that moves us closer to the true or correct value than the status quo. Like the social cost of greenhouse gases is a great example. It is really hard to value the harms of climate change everywhere in the world. Still, the Ninth Circuit has said it was arbitrary and capricious for an agency to decide to exclude it altogether. Why? Because whatever the correct value, however uncertain that may be, zero is certainly not the correct value. And I think broadly the same is true here. You might also think that we ought not count animals because there are just too darn many animals. And that numerosity threatens to overwhelm humans' interests really quickly, to turn EPA into the agency of doing whatever the animals want. And to be sure, this is hard to dismiss out of hand. For every human on Earth, there is some estimated 10 birds, 100,000 fish, 10.1 billion arthropods, maybe 100 billion nematodes. So again, hard to dismiss this concern out of hand. Still, we're talking about administrative agencies. Democratic accountability still pervades this process. There are a lot of levers that the president, who's democratically elected, Congress that's democratically elected, has to influence agency rulemakings. So I am not worried about a federal ban on hamburgers coming anytime soon, even under my proposal. Now, on the other hand, you might think, okay, you've convinced me that we should be regulating in favor of animals, but we ought not do that by valuing animals in CBAs. For example, you might think, well, we already ought to take account of humans' interests, including humans' interests in animal welfare. And that might get us close enough without needing any of this new uncertain stuff. The humans' interests sort of correlate. We like it when animals are benefited. We dislike it when animals are hurt. Now, that argument, I think, fails on a couple of levels. On one hand, cost benefit analysis is about net benefits, that is, total benefits minus total costs. If you are missing a chunk of benefits or costs, it is no answer to say that some of what you counted correlates with some of what you missed. You still have a skewed net benefits calculation if you're missing an absolute value of some chunk. So that's actually not responsive at all. Moreover, even on its own terms, I don't think this argument is quite right. For example, remember the Entergy case that I mentioned? EPA was able to come up with a non-zero value for 1.8% of fish. That doesn't sound like a very high correlation between humans' interests and animals' interests at all. So I am not persuaded by this argument. Now, you also might think we should count animals in regulation, but not through cost-benefit analysis, not by pricing them. Assigning a dollar value to something as sacred as an animal's life or welfare might be trivializing or instrumentalizing that life or welfare in some odious sort of way. At one level, this may be a deeper critique, I think, than just a response to the strong claim. I think this critique might cut to the heart of whether we want to do CBA at all. And on that, I think a lot can be written and a lot could be said, and I'm happy to get to some in the Q&A. Broadly, I think CBA is a decision procedure that does a lot of good government sorts of things that we ought not throw away. But even if you disagree with me on that, all I want to urge at this point is that it is at least a necessary evil. As I mentioned before, this is how we have regulated in no small part since at least President Reagan. This train has left the station. I urge those who are concerned with animals' interests to be on that train. So now I'm going to flip to the how question. If we ought to be doing this, how ought we be valuing animals' interests in CBA? Now, more can be said, more is in the paper. Happy to get into it in Q&A, so I'll just be somewhat brief here. What are the criteria for valuing animals' interests in CBA? We ought to be valuing their life and their welfare. Any metric that gets one but not the other is an incomplete metric, I want to suggest. True, we ought to take steps where we can to avoid undervaluing animals' interests where it is easy to do so. But I want to urge that we should be especially careful in this initial stage of avoiding overvaluing animals' interests for a couple reasons. First, while this is a relatively new, perhaps strange-seeming idea, advancing only lower bound sorts of conservative estimates of animals' interests would help with uptake of this idea. And second, insofar as we are not sure, erring conservative, lower bound, helps ensure that we are flipping only those policies that we are confident truly ought to be flipped. Why? Because if a lower bound conservative value is enough to flip a policy from thumbs down to thumbs up, or to flip policy alternatives rank ordering in terms of net benefits, then we can be confident, but only then can we be confident that the true or correct value indeed ought to do the same flip. And I'll say that some on this call might be worried about locking in biased estimates, perhaps speciesist estimates, which might be the best we could come up with in the initial years. But we ought not, I think, reject those out of hand. Why? Because I think, again, moving from a world in which animals are valued at zero to one in which they are valued at something else is a world that moves away from speciesism broadly, not toward it. So under these criteria, there are a few losers that emerge in terms of methods for valuing animals. One that might be apparent is human willingness to pay for animals' interests in all its forms, including ecosystem services, sort of the good stuff that humans get from nature and the environment, including wild animals. Why would that be? Well, pretty simply, that's just asking a different question. That's asking how much is the human benefited? How much would the human be willing to sacrifice? Not how much is the animal itself or himself or herself. Now, there may be some room for human-derived valuations in all this, but that's going to depend on what humans are thinking when they're coming up with the value. Do they think that it is what they should be willing to pay, or do they think they are standing in the shoes of the animal, so to speak? And how much do they know about what it is like to be the animal? What are they thinking as they come up with this value? I don't want to reject this out of hand, but I want to urge some caution about interpreting human-derived valuations. But there are some winners that ultimately emerge. One way to value animals is to do what I call interspecies comparisons. And first, we're often going to need to use humans as the basis species. And what I want to suggest is that we can take a valuation in that basis species, here humans, and think, well, I think the animal that I am trying to get a value for would value it analogously similarly to how humans value this. Maybe a broken leg versus a broken, hoof or something like that. And if I think that they are valued analogously similarly across the two species, then I could just account for the relevant differences between the species and translate the value from the human to the non-human. So I might multiply by some interspecies conversion factor that it takes account of these relevant differences. For life valuation, it might be the relevant remaining lifespan. That might be a relevant difference. And for any type of valuation, perhaps you might adjust for differences in welfare capacity. Very crudely, how dimly an animal experiences pleasure and pain relative to how vibrantly a human experiences it. And excuse me. Once you have made this translation, then you can translate all sorts of values between all sorts of species. In the longer term, I think we ought to be looking to directly measure animals' preferences. There's kind of no question that animals do make trade-offs that we could quantify. So a chicken might be willing to forego some measurable amount of tasty feed to get better enrichment. And we could perhaps, as a sort of seed of an idea that future work should expand on, monetize that quantifiable amount of tasty feed, assign it a dollar value. Maybe we treat that feed as something like the chicken's income or consumption and make relevant changes to translate again from humans to chickens. Maybe we assign it some conservative value, the global average income or something like that. And then we do the relevant adjustments for stuff like welfare capacity. Then we might be able to monetize these trade-offs in the longer term. But at the very least, before we even do all of this, we should often at least be able to do a break-even analysis for many of these regulations. That just asks, how much would animals' preferences need to be worth in order to support changing the policy? So I did that, for example, for the Entergy case, where EPA again decided to regulate some, but not very stringently to save some fish. And I asked, well, how much would each fish death need to be worth to say that EPA should have taken the more stringent alternative? And I came up with something like $9.88 using a bunch of very, perhaps unduly conservative estimates per what I was saying before that you can read about in the paper. What is $9.88 per death? It is AKA 0.0001%, so sort of two more zeros, of the human value of a statistical life. So you could say that, humans' deaths are worse to the humans than fish deaths are to the fish. You could say that. But now you need to defend that to justify EPA's policy, human deaths are more than 911,000 times more important to the humans than the fish death is to the fish. Another way to ask the question is a fish death 1% likely to have 1/9,000th the impact to the fish as a human death has to the human? If so, then EPA's policy ought to have been more stringent. Now, to ask that kind of question is not to answer it. I want to emphasize that I am not saying this is a rhetorical question, that the fish death obviously is worth that much. But it is at least useful, I would submit, to make these sorts of comparisons explicit and to ask these sorts of questions in a rigorous, specific way. And I want to get to what I'm going to call the CMEP question, which is, well, gosh, okay, we should value animals writ large, maybe, but what about even invertebrates? Even digital minds? Are you sure that we should go that far? Perhaps that's an additional step that we ought to hesitate to take. Now, what I'm going to say is a lot more should be done on this, and I would be excited to contribute to these sorts of questions in future work. But as a first cut, it's going to depend on what this relevant governing statute says the agency is allowed to do. Now, for a lot of these, statutes that I've been talking about before, like EPA's for the Entergy case, the Clean Water Act, I've suggested that the statutes ought not be read to, prohibit valuing animals' interests, and indeed maybe ought to be read to mandate valuing animals' interests. Maybe that's a little less obvious for some of these more marginal cases. For example, I had a think on what sorts of statutes might affect invertebrates like insects. And one I came up with is FIFRA, which regulates insecticides and rodenticides and other pesticides. Well, FIFRA has a benefit cost mandate baked into the statute itself. It calls attention to, quote, the economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits of the use of any pesticide as a part of any regulation of pesticides. It is plausible, I'm just going to say plausible without definitively concluding, that one ought to read FIFRA as implying, as a basic premise for the statute, that killing insects is just okay. That is just something we tolerate. Why? Because we are regulating insecticides. That's the whole point of what we're doing. And we're only stopping regulating when that affects humans too much. Perhaps that is a plausible reading of FIFRA. Still, and as to digital minds, I should say, digital minds are one where I actually don't know what the governing statute is. I'm not sure there is one yet. And so I'm not sure how to read that in the abstract. Still, I want to suggest, even for invertebrates, even for digital minds, it is really hard to resist the gravitational pull of something I said earlier, which is whatever the right value, zero seems wrong in terms of how much we value their interests. So I'm not sure yet how to answer this question with much confidence, but I want to suggest those as sowing the seeds for this kind of conversation. So in closing, I wanted to thank you for joining me in this entry into this really exciting and growing field of animals in CBA. This is just a random smattering of events and initiatives and groups and journal articles and so on in this exciting burgeoning field of accounting for animals' interests in these all-important economic analyses. And I really look forward to your questions, discussions, and follow-up at my email there. Thank you all so much for being part of this.
Okay, Andy. Thank you for that wonderful talk. That was really clear, really helpful, really interesting. I learned a lot. I think everybody did as well. And so now we have time for a discussion. Folks, the Q&A tab is open. If you have any questions or comments at all for Andy, please do enter those in the Q&A tab, and then I can relay them to Andy and we can see what he has to say. In the meantime, I have some of my own questions, and I imagine you have been thinking about these issues as well. especially given how expansive your thinking is here, not only the mammals and birds, but indeed all vertebrates, many invertebrates, possibly even future digital minds. You are right. That is right up the CMEP alley, but I was still pleasantly surprised to hear you take it that far in the talk. So, one question concerns where your idealism bumps into your realism. And you rightly note, hey, we have to start somewhere. And even if we might not yet have the knowledge that we need or the political capital that we need in order to implement an ideal version of the inclusion of animals in cost benefit analysis, we could at least get our foot in the door with something, and that would still be better than nothing, and maybe it would lift the baseline and pave the way for future progress. So all well taken, if I understood you correctly, and I broadly agree. I guess I do want to push you on it a little bit though, and hear what you think about a kind of dilemma where, as with so many first step reforms of this kind, one might worry that this will be acceptable and implementable to the extent that it is really, really misleading and basically humane washes the status quo. Like, people would be willing to add animal welfare as a consideration in cost benefit analysis if it puts more weight behind what they wanted to be doing anyway. But it will be precisely when it pulls in another direction that they will start to not want it to be in there. So is there a risk that including it now rather than later when we have a little bit more knowledge and political capital behind it and we might actually change our minds about what to do because of it, is there a risk that it might do more harm than good by like humane washing whatever bad thing for animals people want to be doing?
Is there a risk of humane washing? I would be remiss to say, or I would be wrong, rather, to say, no, of course, good money would go on. There's always a risk of people taking a good thing and making it, a bad thing in the way of humane washing or greenwashing. Of course, that's a risk. And you are right to push me on this and to be attentive to this. I think I have sort of three general responses here. The first response is, okay, you kind of mentioned this in the lead up to your question, which is, I really do think that the world in which animals are given some non-zero value is a good world, a world in which we can then cite that precedent and then create more precedent where it matters even more and might sting humans a little more in service of helping animals a lot more. I do want to sort of fall back on, I do think that the status quo of zero is hard to do worse than. Putting some non-zero numbers is broadly, hard to argue, I think, as a bad thing. Second, insofar as agencies do things that are like really just not defensible by reference to just basic logic and argumentation and so on. For example, valuing animals' interests only when they're regulating in service of animals, but not otherwise. That is, I think, a good role for courts to play. And there is a standard of arbitrary and capricious that exists within the Administrative Procedure Act, as I said. So any agency action must not be arbitrary and capricious. That's actually kind of a remarkable thing to put into the law because, of course, Congress isn't subject to that. Congress does things that we might think are arbitrary or capricious kind of all the time, and that's fine. So to put in an explicit bar against arbitrary and capricious regulation is kind of a remarkable thing. And I think this is a use case of that sort of standard where agencies, take a completely inconsistent and indefensible stance to when and how they value animals in their CBAs. One that is plainly, inconsistent, like, for example, as you said, valuing it when it helps, but not when it hurts or some such thing. Now, I then want to like really lean into your question and say this is like potentially a quite bad thing. And indeed, insofar as we do it and we maybe go too far too quickly or something like that, we risk, I don't know, even backlash to go in the other direction, not just humane washing, but like to go in the other direction, like we do too much and then Congress gets involved and strikes down the agency action quickly. Maybe people are mad and they vote, elected officials out on this basis or something like that, and it just becomes like kind of politically toxic. If that is a worry, then I think broadly we can endogenize that risk into the analysis itself and into our own analysis of how to set the analysis. What do I mean by that? I'm doing work right now with a colleague of yours, actually, at NYU Law School, so sort of a colleague of yours, Daniel Hemmel. So more to come on this. But broadly, we think that there's a distinction one can make between the decision rule and the meta decision rule that guides your selection of decision rules. What do I mean? The decision rule might be we, use benefit cost analysis to set this with some amount of just discounting animals' interests. How do we set that amount of proper discounting of animals' interests? Well, we might reference our meta decision rule, which is I really want to value animals up until the point that it tips into this kind of popular backlash. And so I'm willing to discount their interests, but not more than is necessary to prevent that kind of backlash. So you can make those kinds of distinctions. And again, I'm like quite happy at this early stage to tolerate some degree of discounting animals' interests, some degree of we might think of as raw speciesism in the analysis in order to get in the door in the first place.
That is a very, very comprehensive answer, and it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, finding the line can still be difficult, but as
Sure.
a an organizing set of principles, it makes sense. I have more questions, but in the meantime, we also have a question in the chat from Avron Hiller. Hi, nice to see you. He says, "Thank you, great project. I know there is a long history of problems using contingent valuation methods for animal valuation. But I wonder if you or others have looked into revealed preference methods for valuation. I think you were hinting at this a little bit in one of your sections that are analogous, he notes, to non-use valuation for environmental entities. An example might be money people pay to visit farm wildlife sanctuaries, ecotourism for animal viewing, surplus people are willing to pay for vegan food, or if anyone has done choice architecture experiments for animal value. And I will just add a little bit onto this question, if I may,
Please.
which is that as you know, Andy, there is this discussion of if we want to use valuation methods in order to set the value of animals, should we use human attitudes about the value of animals, or should we, in some sense, try to take animals' own attitudes into account and use those as a proxy for the strength of their interests and fold it in a different way? So yeah, what do you think about these valuation methods, and to what extent do you think we should be looking to human values versus animal values, non-human values, if we do use them?
Yeah, no, this is great. I really love these questions. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and to hear from you. So this question on contingent valuation versus revealed preference valuation, just to say a few words for any who aren't misfortunate enough to already know what those kinds of big words mean. The a contingent valuation is very broadly speaking where someone is asked what is your relative preference between this thing and that other thing? And then if you ask that sufficiently specifically enough and enough times, then you can come up with how much people say they're willing to trade off different goods. And then you might be able to come up with a price on the unknown good where you don't know its value ex ante. This is a stated preference valuation method. So you're asking someone, what would you be willing to trade off? What would you be willing to pay? But they're not actually paying. They're not actually trading off. So you're right to note that there's an important difference between contingent valuation and revealed preference valuation. That's where someone actually is trading off with skin in the game. Very broadly speaking, the state of the art for benefit cost analysis says that we ought to be looking where possible and all other things equal to revealed preference over stated preference methods. Why? Specifically because someone has skin in the game for a revealed preference method. And not for a stated preference method. And so the stated preference method might be, tainted by things like, well, I really want the person who's, giving this survey to value this highly. So I'll say I would be willing to pay $1,000, whereas I would only actually be willing to pay 100 in real life or something. So that's, I think, broadly where I come out on contingent valuation versus revealed preference. And there are revealed preference ways to get at humans' valuations for animal welfare. You mentioned a few ideas. I think those are great. Others that have been used in, for example, USDA rulemakings is the price premium, the measurable amount of higher price people are willing to pay in the market for higher welfare animal foods, like higher welfare eggs, for example. So you could come up with, cage-free eggs are worth, I don't know, I'm making up numbers, but $2 more per dozen than conventionally manufactured eggs. And so the price premium is, you can do the math from there. And that's people's willingness to pay for cage-free eggs. Still, I think this is slightly conceptually distinct from what I'm arguing for in the paper. That's because, and this gets to Jeff's question, this is still best interpreted as the value to the human for the cage-free eggs. So you might think humans actually get something out of cage-free eggs. They, feel better about themselves or some such thing. And this is generally how benefit cost analysis treats things, as a benefit to the person making the trade-off. So the person and the consumer sovereignty principle, which underlies a lot of benefit cost theory, says we don't look into why the person is willing to make that trade-off, absent some like really, crazy thing going on, like they're willing to make that trade-off because they're an evil person, like a thief's willingness to accept to keep his loot. Like we do care about why they're willing to accept that because it's illegal and wrong. But generally, absent something like illegality or strong immorality underlying the preference, we don't look into the preference. So it is best to treat a human's valuation of cage-free eggs, according to benefit cost theory, as a value to the human. And so too with other sorts of revealed preference methods. That is something that ought to be counted in benefit cost analysis, and indeed is often not counted. We don't actually need any sort of theoretical innovation here. We just need to point out agencies are generally just doing a bad job as to what they already ought to be doing, which is valuing humans' interests in animal welfare. And that is an important point to make. But that is conceptually distinct from the further point that I'm trying to advance in the paper and in this talk, which is we ought to be valuing animals' own interests, their own trade-offs, and their own welfare of its own for its own sake, over and above the nice warm fuzzies that humans feel when animals are benefited.
Or the other sorts of value we derive from them, right?
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Now, just a few more questions to whatever extent we have time. So there are, of course, all kinds of complications here. I would love to ask you about at least two, so I can start with one of them and then turn to the other if time permits.
Sure.
So I asked before about ways this could backfire. You then added further ways it could backfire. Let me now add one more. And I know that you have thought about this. There is, of course, a question not only about whether and to what extent to value animal welfare, like which animals to value and then what weight to give their welfare, but also when to regard their welfare as positive versus negative. And so therefore, when to regard it as a benefit of a policy as opposed to a cost of a policy. And this is a charged question because the line might not always be clear when it comes to whether an animal in captive or wild conditions has a life worth living versus not having a life worth living, if that is how you draw the line between benefits and harms, or happiness and suffering, and so on. There might be other ways of conceptualizing it as well. And of course, how you make these decisions, it could determine whether the inclusion of animal welfare ends up being like a major benefit of, for example, animal agriculture or animal research versus a major cost of animal agriculture or animal research. This is sometimes known as the logic of the larder, the idea that if animals at least have net positive lives, then even if we cause them to suffer and exploit them and kill them prematurely, et cetera, this is still fundamentally a good thing and a benefit, and a further reason to support animal agriculture, as opposed to a reason to go in a different direction. So I guess I wonder how you think about that. Suppose we all agree that we should consider animal welfare in cost benefit analyses, and we all agree on the amount of weight we should assign it. And now we have this question: animals are in captive conditions, being bred and raised and instrumentalized, exploited, exterminated, but maybe they have net positive lives. Would that then count as a benefit? Would it give us more reason to support this industry, even if we have concerns about it? So yeah, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. And as you said, something I've given a lot of thought to and have many thoughts on. I'll try and make it as brief as I can. You are right to draw attention to the idea that we don't know often whether the animal is leading a net positive life or a net negative life. And so whether bringing them into the world is a net benefit or a net cost. I think these are really important questions. I have a few answers. First, a dodge, and then I'll like try and hit it on the head. The dodge is that, look, you are right that this matters for a lot of policies. There are still plenty of policies we can be reasonably confident about that don't involve these really hard questions. So, for example, we have a certain number of chickens that are laying eggs for human consumption. Should they be in cages or not? As far best I can tell, that marginal change, this many chickens with cages to that many same number of chickens with no cages, is something that could be set by policy and that could affect some marginal change. So there's still plenty of purchase and still plenty to do, even if we completely set that question to the side. So that's my dodge question: is that not everything, and perhaps there's still a lot we can do without having to answer this hard question. But there may be times where we do have to answer this hard question, or might want to, start thinking about this. So I think baked into your question is a question of part of the question is empirical. Are the animals net happy or net sad? And I don't have any special comparative advantage on that question. But part of it is somewhat philosophical, like how ought we think about bringing new lives into existence? How should we treat that, as a benefit or as a cost? Now, I have actually a paper with an economist named Danny Bressler saying that benefit cost analysis has taken far too little time to think about its population ethics sort of implications. Is it good if, for example, a ton of humans are wiped out? Obviously, that's not good. But is it good only because those humans are wiped out, or also because then their progeny never come into existence in the first place? That is a question that benefit cost analysis ought to be grappling with more, and generally just takes no stance on, which we contend is taking a stance, and indeed a contestable one, by omitting
Mhm.
those people not coming into existence in the first place. Now, there's plenty to say. This is not like, therefore, agencies ought to account for these, people who don't come into existence in the first place. That's not our conclusion. Our conclusion is narrowly, BCA ought to grapple with this. And this might be doubly true with animals, where a whole lot more policies affect whether they come into being in the first place than perhaps for humans. So I don't have anything special or to add on the empirical question, but I do have a lot to say that this is really an important philosophical question because a lot might ride on it. Still, I think in the near term, we can look for these win-win solutions that don't involve these hard questions, these contestable, perhaps really problematic questions, and at least get animals on the balance sheet there. And then think really hard, as Danny and I urge, about the implications for those further harder questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I would love to follow up on that and ask you to say a little bit more about this creation ethics and policy question. I agree with you. The fact that cost benefit analysis is generally silent on the welfare impacts of creating or not creating lives is striking because so many policies, their major impacts will be on future lives and not current lives. Now, of course, this opens up a whole set of questions about creation ethics and population ethics, which are famously difficult and contested. And I can see why people are nervous to touch them and factor them into any kind of mainstream cost benefit analysis that informs policy. Nevertheless, it is where arguably the vast majority of the value of actions lies from a welfarist perspective, even in the human case. And then, as you say, especially in the non-human case, in the non-human animal case, this could also be true of digital minds if and when we ever factor them in. And as a general rule, this is not exactly ironclad, but as a general rule, the largest non-human populations are often the shortest lived animals, where a decision I make today, almost by definition, is going to affect beings who do not yet exist and who may or may not come into existence. So, for example, if we consider our selected species, like insect species who live for a year or less, then almost certainly we would be, for the most part, thinking about the effects on future animals. So I know that you touched on the importance and the difficulty of this a moment ago, but I guess I would just love to invite you to say a little bit more about, first of all, to what extent is this a useful exercise if they are not being factored in? If we really are focusing only on currently alive animals, and then second of all, what kinds of first step incrementalist Andy ideas do you have for getting our foot in the door for future beings in these cost benefit analyses?
Yeah, no, this is great. So Danny Bressler and I wrote this paper that I'll sort of lean on some in this answer. It's called "Valuing Statistical Absences." I forget what comes after the colon, but with a question mark. Valuing statistical absences, question mark. It's published in Ecological Economics if anyone wants to look at it. And broadly, I mean, we take on only humans for this, and we have a footnote where we say we're setting aside for the moment the really important question of non-human animals. But I'll try and say a few words on that now. So what do we say for humans? I mean, we start with Nozick's famous question of which is we know which is worse. So one, peace, two, nuclear war that kills 99% of people, and three, nuclear war that kills 100% of people. Obviously, that goes in ascending order of badness, but how much worse is moving from one to two, and how much worse is moving from two to three? A lot of people think that moving from two to three is actually the worst jump, adding more badness to the world. Well, how can you defend that? Fewer marginal people dying. You have to factor in the people who never come into existence in the first place. In philosophical terms, I understand this to be named absences by John Broome, someone who would have come into existence and then counterfactually doesn't because of some action taken or some policy or something. So how should benefit cost analysis treat absences? Mostly, it just, entirely, it just doesn't. It just values or never asks the question, how many people counterfactually don't come into existence now? And for reasons you said, like that makes intuitive sense. This is really hard and contested. But I think saying we're not going to value the absences is taking a side in this contested debate, and indeed a contestable side in a contestable debate. It would hold that we should value moving from two to three 1% as badly as we value moving from 1 to 2, even though that's like a lot worse, according to many people that move from 2 to 3. So so we identify some domains where it is pretty clear, including the domain of human extinction or catastrophic risks, where it's pretty clear that one ought to be valuing absences. And then we identify some domains where it seems perfectly defensible, perhaps not to value absences. For example, where reproductive rights might be at stake, which is recognized by, for example, the Supreme Court as one of the rights tenant in the 14th Amendment and so on. So there are some domains where valuing absences might actually stand on certain rights that we're happy to just put as a sort of side constraint on our on our inquiry, as happens routinely in benefit cost analysis. Of course, you can't do a benefit cost analysis that would, or an agent couldn't act at least on a benefit cost analysis that would suggest violating someone's rights granted by the Constitution or otherwise. So this is sort of one thing that we're happy to concede the ground on, and not even concede the ground as though we're doing it through gritted teeth. We're like quite happy that that would be the outcome. So we could translate this exercise of finding domains where it is clearly important to consider the absences, or clearly important to ignore the absences or value them at 0, to animals. And I think, for example, like puppy mills bring in a lot of beings to existence who, at least arguably, lead pretty darn bad lives for at least a lot of their lives. Now you could complicate that because some number of them then go on to homes where they presumably live like pretty good lives. But this is an important question where, should that life be brought into existence in the first place? Seems like maybe the entire ballgame. And so for cost benefit analysis, just to take a hands-off, I don't know approach, so we're going to evaluate it at 0, seems like the wrong answer there. So too, for all sorts of policies that may shape how many beings come into existence, when that is, as you say, like one of the most important things that might be going on. So what should we do? Should we always be, taking, let's say, a total utilitarian approach, is sort of approach in cost benefit analysis? Should we always be taking an average utilitarian approach? I don't know the answer to that. But agencies should take a considered approach with reference to maybe their statutory mandate that allows them to regulate in the first place. And then asking these questions. Maybe this is like a sort of domain calling out for a considered panel that produces a report with some philosophers, some economists, some maybe natural scientists, et cetera, that inform the agency, these are the options and these are the relative ethical trade-offs among them or something. This has been done before by agencies for various ethical decisions like conflicts between species. How should we care about conflicts between a species that might go endangered and a more numerous species that would not? So this is, I think, another domain where that kind of inquiry could be really valuable.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that answer. Obviously, really fleshed out, and so people should check out your work for more information about this. I think this is the right place to end. We are at time, and thank you again to everybody for being here. And I want to especially thank Audrey Becker for organizing this, and then especially Andy for taking the time to visit us and speak with us today. I think this work obviously is very difficult, very complicated, raises all kinds of questions and confusing issues that we need to sort through, like where to draw the line between benefits and costs and how to value future lives and so on. But I agree with you that we need to start somewhere instead of waiting for it to be perfect before we implement it at all. So figuring out those details, I think, is the right place to be focusing our attention. And I really appreciate your work in helping guide attention in that direction. So again, thank you everybody, and Andy, looking forward to staying in touch and following your work, and hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone else for attending. Really delighted to be here.